and Ranking Member Durbin, for the letter you sent to the President taking issue with the firing of more than a dozen inspector generals without the statutory required notice and case-by-case details setting out the justification for why each was fired. I'm grateful for that important step towards accountability and affirming the law. Whether it is the firing of independent watchdogs or the impoundment of funds appropriated by Congress for the American people, or attempts to amend the Constitution by executive order, if we don't take steps to insist that the executive branch adhere to the laws that we pass, if instead we leave it all to the courts, we might as well go home. We will not be doing our jobs as the founders intended. On Monday, Acting Attorney General James McHenry, at the direction of the White House, fired more than a dozen key officials who worked on Special Counsel Jack Smith's team on cases involving President Trump. Fired them, just like that. Also on Monday, the acting U.S. Attorney in Washington, D.C., Ed Martin, a Stop the Steal advocate and election denier, initiated a review of prosecutors in his own office for pursuing federal obstruction charges against January 6 defendants. The investigation of the investigators had begun. We are seeing similar purges throughout the federal government, but these purges, targeting independent government watchdogs, targeting career prosecutors, dedicated to the principle that no one is above the law, these purges are particularly significant because more than any other, they open the door to rampant corruption, malfeasance, and one-man rule. In a decision that will live in infamy, the Supreme Court of the United States has given the President immunity for crimes committed while in office, and in the case of the Justice Department, that immunity is absolute, and the President will use it, and any other invitation to lawlessness that we give him, either in the form of a court decision like that one, or permission, implicit or explicit, that we in this body give him to ignore the law, whether that law pertains to impoundment, inspectors general, federal employees, or anything else. As a bulwark for protecting the rule of law, no position is more important to the country than that of Attorney General. And yet, as a spearhead to violate the rule of law and turn our justice system into a system of repression, no position is more important to the President than that of Attorney General, which is why the stakes are so high with this nomination. Against this backdrop, America needs an Attorney General who will refuse to use the awesome power of the Justice Department against the President's enemies without any factual basis and simply because he wants them to. Someone who has the independence, the stature, the strength of character to say no when she is asked by the President to do things that violate her oath and conscience. She must be willing to speak the truth to power, whether that power is the President of the United States or anyone else. Someone who understands that she is the people's lawyer, not the President's Roy Cohn. Judged by that standard and by her testimony before this committee, Pam Bondi does not meet the test. She just doesn't. During her hearing, I asked Ms. Bondi if she was prepared to advise the President against offering blanket pardons to those involved in the January 6th insurrection, particularly for those who committed violent offenses and beat police officers. Ms. Bondi told me that pardons are at the discretion of the President and that she would, quote, look at every case. She said she would do so on a case-by-case basis. Of course, we know now it is too late for that. On his first day in office and with a stroke of a pen, President Trump issued sweeping and unprecedented pardons for more than 1,500 January 6 defendants, including those charged with assaulting law enforcement. During the hearing, I asked Ms. Bondi whether she had a factual basis to investigate Jack Smith, one of the President's perceived enemies. After a prolonged effort to avoid answering the question, I tried again. Just tell us, are you aware? Tell us, are you aware of a factual basis, a factual predicate to investigate Jack Smith, yes or no? Senator, she said, what I'm hearing on the news is horrible. Are you aware, I tried again, of you seem, she responded, do I know if he has committed a crime? I have not looked. She was not able to tell us what should be obvious, that she has no factual basis to investigate Jack Smith, but instead she told us, "What I'm hearing on the news is horrible. Do I know if he has committed a crime? I have not looked." If this was meant to be reassuring of her obedience to the law and not her obedience to the person of the president, it was not successful. "What I'm hearing on the news is horrible," she said. Yes, it is, and I wonder why. Perhaps, just maybe, it's because this president has been filling the news with false attacks on Jack Smith for years, false attacks that have been endlessly amplified and repeated by others. If this kind of circular logic is what passes for a factual predicate for investigating the president's enemies, no one will be safe. Do I know if he has committed a crime? The nominee asked rhetorically. I have not looked. The implication, I have to believe, is that she will indeed look. But look at what? Look for what? Look for a crime? This is not how the justice system is supposed to work. Lest her answer about Jack Smith was an aberration, I asked her about another favorite target of the president, Liz Cheney. I asked Ms. Bondi, the president also wants to jail Liz Cheney. Sitting here today, are you aware of any factual basis to investigate Liz Cheney, yes or no? She replied, that's a hypothetical, and I'm not going to answer that question. But is it really a hypothetical after all the president has said and so publicly about what he wants to see done with Liz Cheney? Perhaps she will look. I asked her if she could speak truth to power, whether she could confront the president with the loss of the 2020 election, and she could not say, or would not say, yes. Having falsely suggested during the campaign as an advocate for the president that he won states like Pennsylvania that he plainly lost, I asked her if she could state, as the plain record makes clear, that there was no massive fraud affecting the outcome of the 2020 election. She could not answer that question with a yes either. If she cannot state the obvious to this committee long after an election, how can we expect her as Attorney General to speak plainly and accurately about an election in the future if it doesn't go her way or the way of her party? Finally, I asked Ms. Bondi if she was ready to commit to preserving the evidence in the January 6th investigation. She was not ready to make that commitment or could not make that commitment. Apart from a vague commitment to follow the law, she could not even commit to preserving evidence of a crime. She said, quote, I will follow the law. Well, that used to mean something, but then I'm sure Donald Trump would say he is following the law when he tries to amend the Constitution by executive order. In fact, his Justice Department is saying exactly that. Experience is important, and as my colleagues have pointed out, and I quite agree, Ms. Bondi is an experienced prosecutor. But independence, the willingness to speak truth to power, the willingness to say no when a president asks you to go after his enemies, these qualities are essential. Regrettably, Ms. Bondi demonstrated none of these essential prerequisites for the job of the nation's top law enforcement officer. None. I voted no. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Also a fair career prosecutor who built her reputation by enforcing the rule of law. She spent 18 years serving as a prosecutor before being elected 2 terms as Florida Attorney General. Her record shows that she's willing to tackle and to solve some of the hardest problems facing our nation. As Florida's Attorney General, Ms. Bondi focused on human trafficking, led the fight against opioid pill mills, protected consumers, and sought justice for victims of violent criminals. Her record and her testimony showed the American people that she will follow through and enforce the law fairly, without fear or favor. On the second day of her hearing, we heard from witnesses who praised Ms. Bondi's character, her fairness, her willingness to work with members of both parties to solve hard problems. So we heard from an elected Democrat who never voted for President Trump. He told us that Ms. Bondi was fair, tethered to the rule of law, and could work with both Democrat and Republicans to serve the American people. We heard from Florida's statewide prosecutor, who praised her competence running the legal department of a third largest state of our nation. We heard from a Florida sheriff who testified about her commitment to law and order and her partnership with law enforcement to keep Floridians safe. These witnesses have worked with Ms. Bondi for decades, and they all vouched for her capability and character. Ms. Bondi's nomination has received a flood of support from all across America. Law enforcement groups representing more than 650,000 officers wrote to this committee and urged us to support the nomination. A few of these groups include the National Association of Police Organizations, the Fraternal Order of Police, National Sheriff's Association, Major County Sheriffs, National Narcotic Officers Association, International Association of Chiefs of Police, and many others. This support is a testament to Ms. Bondi's history of backing law enforcement. We also received letters from more than 100 former senior DOJ officials, scores of U.S. attorneys, dozens of state attorneys general, women's rights groups, Second Amendment groups, and others who all strongly support the nominee. I'd like to take a few minutes to address some of the attacks against Ms. Bondi. Several members of this committee characterized Ms. Bondi as an election denier. This is inconsistent with her own statements because on multiple occasions during her hearing, Ms. Bondi stated that President Biden was the president and that she, quote unquote, accepted the results. As I said during the hearing, questioning the results of an election does not make one an election denier. If this is the criteria by which we judge public officials, scores of Democrats, including some on this committee, are similarly situated. Minority Leader Schumer cast doubt on Senator Casey's loss of Pennsylvania just a few months ago. Hillary Clinton elected Democrats have called President Trump an illegitimate president and suggested the 2016 election was stolen. Stacey Abrams and even some members of this committee suggested the 2018 Georgia governor's election was, quote unquote, stolen. The attacks against Ms. Bondi on this point of a partisan double standard. Some of my colleagues also implied that Ms. Bondi's lobbying career should be disqualifying. This too was very unfair. Ms. Bondi disclosed her lobbying work and her clients to this committee beyond what she was even required to do. She's been more transparent than other recent nominees, and there is no reason to think that she would not follow the law and recuse herself when conflicts of interest are shown. Democrats didn't voice concern when one of President Biden's DOJ's nominees worked for China and Huawei during his time in private practice, nor did we hear concerns about former Attorney General Holder's lobbying activities. Now, when Senator Tillis pressed Democrat witness Ms. Jennifer Gilbert to articulate specific concerns with Ms. Bondi's lobbying career, she was unable to point to anything specific. She just kept repeating that Ms. Bondi's former clients would give, quote unquote, the appearance of impropriety. Vague assertions of potential conflicts of interest are not a reason to oppose a nominee who pledged to follow established procedures regarding these conflicts. Some of my colleagues also suggest that Ms. Bondi's loyalty to President Trump is somehow disqualifying. It is not persuasive in any way. There's nothing wrong with President Trump appointing someone who has fiercely defended him to a high position. Ms. Bondi publicly supported President Trump, just like 77 million Americans who voted him back into office in November. So this too is not a disqualifying attribute. The president has the right to choose an attorney general who is loyal and will faithfully carry out the vision for America that this president ran on. I note that Democrats did not voice concerns about the loyalty of Attorney General Holder, described himself as President Obama's wingman. And of course, we all remember that President John F. Kennedy appointed his own brother to serve as Attorney General. Many of my colleagues also suggested that Ms. Bondi was too partisan for a role at the Department of Justice. This is surprising to me, considering that many of my colleagues routinely voted for highly partisan DOJ officials and even judicial nominees over the last 4 years. And a few examples would be Vanita Gupta, who on opening night of the Republican National Convention in 2020 tweeted, quote, "Don't know if I can take 3 more nights of racism, xenophobia, and outrageous lies," end of quote. Matt Olson, Assistant Attorney General for National Security Divisions, was penned an op-ed to Time Magazine in 2016 entitled, quote, "Why ISIS Supports Donald Trump," end of quote. Judge Dale Ho, who suggested that his work was motivated by, quote, "hate for conservatives," end quote, and who described himself as a, quote, "wild-eyed sort of leftist," end of quote. These openly partisan statements didn't bother my colleagues, so if they're fair, they shouldn't be bothered by Ms. Bondi's support of President Trump. Finally, I want to address a smear from the legacy media who claimed that I was repeating a, quote, "discredited myth," end of quote, when I said that the, quote, "FBI opened dozens of investigations into parents who voiced concern at school board meetings regarding curriculum choices and COVID-19 mandates, end of quote. To set the record straight, these are the facts. On October 4th, 2021, General Garland issued a memorandum directing law enforcement to address threats against school administrators and board members. This was in response to a letter requested by the National School Boards Association to President Biden that they later apologized for. That organization said, quote, there was no justification for some of the language included in the letter. But that apology was too little, too late. By October 20th, 21, FBI Counterterrorism Division had acted on General Garland's directive and announced a new threat tag to use against parents voicing concerns. That threat tag was, quote, EDU officials, end of quote, as in education officials. FBI whistleblowers came forward stating that, quote, at least a dozen of investigations into parents, end of quote, and had been started using the new threat tag. As of October 27th, 2021, Senate Judiciary Oversight hearing, I directly asked Attorney General Garland to retract his memo. You know, he refused. On February 3rd, 2023, House Judiciary Committee Chairman Jim Jordan subpoenaed FBI Director Wray for documents related to the misuse, what quote unquote, the misuse of federal and counterterrorism resources to target parents. In response to the subpoena, the FBI acknowledged for the first time that it opened 25, quote, guardian assessments, end quote, including 6 that were run by the FBI Counterterrorism Division. These government-funded and resourced investigations didn't identify any legitimate threats. I'll now turn to Ranking Member Durbin.
Thanks, Chairman Grassley. If you want to know the role of the Department of Justice under President Trump, just listen to his words. He said, I have the absolute right to do what I want to do with the Justice Department, end of quote. He not only uses the Justice Department to advance his political interest, but he's also promised to seek, quote, retribution against, quote, the enemy within. The president has repeatedly threatened to weaponize the justice system against those he feels have wronged him, and that's a long list. It includes career prosecutors, military officials, and his own former political appointees. Unfortunately, we are seeing these threats emerge in real time. Last week, the Trump administration reassigned and removed at least 20 senior career National Security Division and Criminal Division attorneys, including one prosecutor who had served in the National Security Division since its inception under George W. Bush. President Trump also forced out both FBI Director Christopher Wray and Deputy Director Paul Abate, creating a leadership vacuum in that important agency. These moves, clearly made in the interest of installing his own loyalists, put our national security and public safety at risk. The U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia is further proof of President Trump's commitment to putting his interests ahead of those of the American people. Last week, he installed Ed Martin as interim U.S. Attorney here in Washington, D.C. Mr. Martin was a leader of the so-called Stop the Steal movement to overturn the 2020 election, and Mr. Martin defended several January 6 rioters. Mr. Martin was on the grounds of the U.S. Capitol on January 6. He posted the following on social media, and I quote, like Mardi Gras in D.C. today, love, faith, and joy. Ignore fake news." End of quote. Mr. Martin has already dismissed all pending charges against January 6 defendants, shut down the section of the office that was handling those cases. He's opened an investigation into the office's January 6 prosecutions, apparently to begin carrying out Pam Bondi's promise to, quote, "prosecute the prosecutors, investigate the investigators." In a related development yesterday, Acting Attorney General James McHenry moved to fire a number of career Justice Department employees because, quote, "you played a significant role in prosecuting President Trump," end of quote. Retaliating against these career public officials who were simply doing the job they were assigned is patently unfair. Asked repeatedly who will execute the mass deportation effort, we have finally come to learn which agencies will bear that responsibility. They include the Drug Enforcement Administration, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and other Justice Department law enforcement agencies. Now, instead of investigating fentanyl and the firearms trafficking to Mexico to the cartels, DEA and ATF resources will be diverted toward deporting families who may or may not have any criminal record or be any danger to this country. And in the latest blow, President Trump's illegal funding freeze jeopardizes critical Justice Department grants that support local law enforcement and survivors of domestic violence, sex trafficking, and other violent crimes. Given the massive upheaval that President Trump has caused at the Justice Department in just the first few days in office, the next Attorney General will have their work cut out for them. As I said during Ms. Bondi's hearing, it is absolutely critical that any nominee for the position be committed first and foremost to the Constitution and the American people, not the president and his political agenda. Unfortunately, I'm unconvinced that Ms. Bondi shares my belief. She is one of 4 personal lawyers of President Trump that is already already selected for top positions at the Department of Justice. And she has echoed President Trump's calls for exacting revenge on political opponents. Ms. Bondi undermined our democracy by joining President Trump's efforts to overturn the 2020 election. It appears she does not regret that decision, as she refused before this committee repeatedly during her hearing to acknowledge that President Trump actually lost the vote in 2020. During her hearing, I asked if she was familiar with the January 2021 phone call in which President Trump called on a Republican Georgia Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, quote, to find 11,780 votes. Ms. Bondi denied ever having listened to the phone call. However, in August of 2023, she appeared on a news program and defended President Trump's conduct with Raffensperger. She stated that his actions were, quote, not a crime and were instead, quote, free speech. She condemned the criminal charges that had been filed against President Trump due to his conduct on that call, where he asked the Georgia Secretary of State, quote, to find 11,780 votes. I asked Ms. Bondi to explain why she spoke so authoritatively on the legal strength of the case when she was, according to her own claim before this committee, unfamiliar with the evidence. Her explanation that she was on television, not in a court. It is deeply concerning that someone seeking the role of Attorney General believes it's appropriate to comment publicly on a criminal case without conducting even a minimal assessment of the evidence. The role of Attorney General is a serious one. It requires a person be committed to facts and the law, not someone who is willing to say whatever is politically expedient. During Ms. Bondi's